So in the last video, we talked about shipping Claude Code in a containerized environment onto Railway, where we can kind of keep Claude Code isolated away from our personal computers. However, if you're really security-minded, you can start to kind of pick apart the flaws in this approach. Sure, we've isolated Claude Code away from our personal machine. However, depending on the actual command line tools that we sign in with on this container, Claude Code could still have access to all sorts of production systems. And so with Railway, we're kind of restricted in terms of what we can actually enforce from a security perspective on that container. So I'm going to kind of reframe that whole approach around Azure today, which is a very common weapon of choice for IT folks all across many industries. I'm just going to show a quick demonstration of what could potentially go wrong with Claude Code if we've kind of over-credentialed the environment in which it runs. So in this case, I've got an Azure tenant set up. I've got a DevOps organization set up. And so when I'm just authenticated with my normal credentials, I have all sorts of access to read and write operations through the Azure command line interface. So I can do something like in my Firstloop DevOps organization, create a new project called test2. Use the Azure CLI. And so this is just running on my normal developer machine right now, where I am authenticated with my normal credentials to Azure DevOps. And we can see now that it's just going ahead and running some bash commands using that Azure CLI to create a project. And as you can see, Claude very willingly went ahead and created that project. And we can also do something like, now delete it, because my account has access to delete projects in DevOps. And as you can see, we go ahead and run this, and it went ahead and deleted. And so you might be thinking, well, Claude offers an enterprise edition, and I can go ahead and be very restrictive about the bash commands that it's actually allowed to execute. And I fully agree with you there. However, if you start to kind of pick apart the complexity, you can start to imagine that it becomes really tricky to make sure that all operations that Claude is allowed to or permitted to perform are configured appropriately if you're just specifically handling bash commands. There's a whole range of tools you have to deal with. The complexity really just explodes. And if you start using wildcards, you really risk opening yourself up to all sorts of issues. So really kind of the natural progression here is, if you're using a tool like Azure, AWS to kind of manage your organization, you probably are already doing all sorts of RBAC control configurations for identities and grouping people and determining the permissions that they're allowed to use. And so we can kind of follow that same model for Claude Code. And we're going to use the same containerized approach we did in the past session. So in this case, what we're actually going to do is deploy a virtual machine to Azure. We're going to credential that with a very specific managed identity, a user-assigned managed identity, which will be used to authenticate with all Azure resources from that container. What this allows us to do is decouple the Azure credentials Claude Code is allowed to use from the actual developer or user, who is me in this case, who has way more permissions than we would generally be comfortable with giving Claude. So if we pop over to Azure, here's kind of just the basic setup. There's not much to it right now. This is strictly just for demo purposes, but just to give kind of a high-level overview, I've set up a VM with a network security group, and I've kind of linked these all together. This is a very normal VM setup. You've got your disk here, your virtual network, your network interface card, and that's just going to be a very standard VM deployment. However, I've also linked this managed identity to it. What happens here is when this VM is deployed, the credentials for this managed identity are automatically coupled to the virtual machine. And so when we're using command line tools like the Azure CLI, it will just be able to authenticate as that managed identity for all of the bash calls. And thus, any permissions that we grant this managed identity, we are effectively granting Claude. So this, like I said, allows us to decouple the identity and the permissions in Azure and basically any Microsoft product that Claude has access to, because it's now going to be using this managed identity through the command line, and it's not going to be using mine. And then just for a bit of extra pizzazz, I went ahead and set up Bastion, which is kind of just a convenience layer on top of VMs so that we're not just connecting over bare RDP and SSH sessions. And we can actually sign in with our Azure credentials through Bastion. So that means that, we can assign a virtual machine user who would be me, my actual AAD credentials in this case, so that I can access the VM without, using any sort of secrets or passwords. Cool. So now, what we're going to do is, since I've already deployed all of this, I'm going to open up a new tab here in my terminal, and I'm just going to use the AZ CLI Bastion SSH command to connect into that VM. And so this is just going to automatically generate an SSH certificate for me using my AAD credentials, and we can see that I'm now signed in. So if we run AZ account show, we'll actually be able to see, okay, we're using that user assigned managed identity. And there are some prerequisite steps here just for using using this managed identity. And the steps are pretty simple. We'd say AZ login account, and then we can just pass in that ID. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, what's to stop a user from signing in with their own credentials here? That's where policies like conditional access policies or just Intune come into play. I'm going to save that for a later video if there's interest, but essentially what we could do is say, it's very standard to basically configure policies, conditional access policy, to require devices to be compliant and MDM enrolled. So that would mean, because we didn't MDM enroll this VM, and we would want to effectively block MDM enrollment of this, the user who's us, would never be able to sign in with their own credentials on this VM. So more or less, it becomes locked to the managed identity. Actually, before we jump into Claude, I just want to pop over and show some of the permissions that I've set on this managed identity. So I've already created this Claude Code agents account, or agents group in DevOps, and you can see I've added that managed identity over here. So we can be really crisp on the permissions that Claude gets. As you can see, I've denied pretty much any possible write operation at the project level. We want Claude to be able to see project information, but it shouldn't be able to edit anything. And as we know from the demo I showed, I'm able to do things like delete team projects and rename them and do all of these potentially sensitive write operations. Similarly, if we pop down here, we see create test runs. Maybe we want to allow that. It's kind of a scoped write operation, and maybe it decides it needs to kick something off, but we definitely don't want it deleting or modifying those test runs. And if we jump into the actual repository as well, what we would want to do here is go ahead and configure some more specific permissions to do, possibly prevent branches or pushes to the main branch, or make sure that maybe I'm allowed to bypass branch policy as kind of an authoritative figure in this organization. We obviously don't want Claude to be able to do that. So we can really be very fine-grained about exactly what Claude is allowed to do. And this follows the much more traditional approach, obviously, of specifying permissions, RBAC roles in the actual system. We're not relying on allowing or disallowing a very potentially lengthy list of bash commands that Claude is allowed to use through the enterprise configuration. But anyways, if we pop over here, we're going to run that same test. So I'm just going to say, start with, tell me about my DevOps projects in the Firstloop org, use the Azure CLI. So we're going to go ahead and let that run. It should be able to see the projects. Okay, it sees test, which is the only active project. Okay, so it ran a couple of extra commands there too. In general, reads are all right. So I'm going to ask it, can you please delete the test project? And we'll let that run. It's willingly going to do that. It ran the command, but as you can see, it was blocked due to insufficient permissions, which is exactly what we wanted. Similarly, can you create me a new project named test2? Again, this should be blocked. We're not going to allow Claude to go creating projects willy-nilly. And there you go. Insufficient permissions. So this is kind of the next step, as I mentioned, of just running Claude in a containerized environment with very specific permissions that are completely isolated from the actual employee/users permissions, which are almost always going to be over-credentialed. This is how I kind of envision Claude Code operating in an enterprise environment. You know, we get this dedicated VM or just container in general where it's allowed to run. We pre-provision it with its own specific credentials that it uses to access any of our internal or external systems. And that way we can continue using RBAC roles and very specific permissions within those systems to actually gate what it's allowed to do. And we're not relying on potentially fragile allow and disallow lists of those bash commands or MCP tools. So really, we could even just go ahead and say, Claude, run with full permissions. You're allowed to do anything within this container. And because we've gone ahead and given it those specific credentials on all of our systems, we don't have to worry about it potentially doing something destructive as long as we've configured everything to our desire. So if folks are interested in seeing, how do we go even further with this? I mentioned some of those conditional access policies and Intune device enrollment to actually prevent users from potentially signing in with their own credentials on this account and bypassing the whole managed identity setup. Let me know. I'm happy to create a video on that. But for now, this should be a great start to seeing how Claude Code can run in your organization. Thanks for watching the video.